The rain fell softly on the cobblestones of Rome, as though the city itself were holding its breath. It was October 1922, and shadows gathered at the edges of the capital. Boots struck stone in steady rhythm. Flags rippled in the damp wind. Somewhere between fear and hope, a nation waited. Italy had been promised glory. Instead, she received humiliation. The Great War had ended, but the peace felt like defeat. Factories stood silent. Veterans limped home to poverty. Politicians argued while the streets boiled with anger. And in that unrest, a man stepped forward, convinced that destiny had chosen him. He did not yet call himself an emperor, but he spoke of Rome as if it were unfinished business, as if the ancient eagles had merely been resting. From balconies, he promised discipline, order, greatness. From train platforms, he promised bread and pride. Crowds leaned closer, hungry not just for food, but for meaning. Yet even in those early days, there was something fragile beneath the thunder of applause. Power won through spectacle demands more spectacle. Pride built on myth cannot tolerate weakness. And when a man mistakes himself for an empire, the fall is never private. 2 decades later, in another Italian city square, a body would hang upside down before a furious crowd. The final image of a dream that mistook the theater for eternity. Welcome to Dynasty Estates Chronicles, where we bring you powerful stories of ambition, empire, and the towering figures who believed they could shape history itself. Here, we explore the rise and fall of those who built legacies in marble and myth, and the human costs hidden beneath the grandeur. If you are drawn to stories of power, pride, and the fragile line between greatness and ruin, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the bell icon so you never miss an episode. Join us as we uncover the dynasties that tried to outlive time. Benito Mussolini was born on the 29th of July, 1883, in the small village of Pretapio, in northern Italy. The land around his home was rough and agricultural, shaped by poverty and hard labor. Italy itself was young, only unified a generation earlier, and still struggling to find its identity. In this restless environment, the boy who would one day call himself Il Duce learned early that life favored the bold. His father, Alessandro Mussolini, was a blacksmith and a committed socialist. He admired revolutionaries and often filled the family home with talk of class struggle and political rebellion. Benito was named after Benito Juarez, the Mexican revolutionary leader, a choice that reflected Alessandro's fierce political beliefs. His mother, Rosa Maltoni, was a devout Catholic and a schoolteacher. Where his father valued defiance, she valued discipline and learning. Between these two influences, Benito grew up surrounded by both anger and structure, rebellion and order. From childhood, he displayed a sharp intelligence and an explosive temper. He was frequently in trouble at school. At one boarding school run by Catholic priests, he stabbed a fellow student with a penknife during a quarrel. In another incident, he was expelled for attacking a classmate. Violence, even in youth, became a tool, not merely of anger, but of assertion. He learned that fear could command attention when respect did not come freely. Italy at the turn of the century was divided between industrial progress in the north and rural hardship in the south. Workers protested. Socialists organized. The government seemed distant and weak. Young Mussolini absorbed these tensions deeply. He trained as a schoolteacher, briefly following his mother's path, but he soon grew restless. The classroom felt too small for his ambitions. In 1902, seeking escape from poverty and compulsory military service, he fled to Switzerland. There, he lived in near destitution, sleeping in cheap lodgings and taking temporary jobs. Yet these difficult years hardened him. Arid widely, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and revolutionary theorists who wrote of power, will, and destiny. He became active in socialist circles and gained a reputation as a fiery speaker. His voice was commanding, his language theatrical. Even then, he understood that politics was not only about ideas. It was about performance. By 1912, his talents had brought him national recognition. He became editor of Avanti, the official newspaper of the Italian Socialist Party. Circulation doubled under his leadership. He wrote with urgency and aggression, attacking the establishment and calling for radical change. He once declared, "Violence is the midwife of history," revealing his belief that transformation required force. Yet beneath his rise within socialism lay an impatience. He admired strength more than equality. He respected action more than debate. These early convictions would later shape his greatest decisions. In 1914, as Europe moved toward war, Mussolini made a choice that would alter his destiny. He broke from the Socialist Party by supporting Italy's entry into the First World War, a position seen as betrayal by his comrades. Former allies turned against him. Trust fractured. It was the first major sacrifice in his pursuit of power, and it would not be the last. In 1914, as Europe edged towards catastrophe, Mussolini stood at a crossroads. The Italian Socialist Party opposed the war, calling it a conflict between rival empires that would sacrifice workers for the pride of kings. Yet Mussolini shocked his comrades by arguing that Italy must join the fighting. He claimed war would forge national unity and sweep away weak leadership. To many, it was unforgivable betrayal. He was expelled from the party he had helped strengthen. This rupture was not merely political, it was personal. Former friends denounced him. His name, once praised in socialist circles, became cursed. Yet Mussolini refused to retreat. He founded a new newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, funded in part by industrialists who favored intervention. His rhetoric shifted from class struggle to national destiny. Italy, he argued, deserved greatness, not caution. When Italy entered the war in 1915, Mussolini enlisted, though he served only until 1917, when he was wounded in a training accident. The experience reshaped him. The trenches were brutal, yet they confirmed his belief that hardship purified men. War, in his mind, stripped away softness and created discipline. He returned from the front, convinced that peace would disappoint those who had sacrificed. The end of the war in 1918 did indeed bring bitterness. Though Italy had fought alongside the victors, many felt cheated by the peace treaties. Promised territories were not fully granted. The phrase, mutilated victory, spread through newspapers. Inflation soared. Strikes paralysed factories. Socialist movements gained momentum, frightening landowners and industrial elites. Sensing opportunity in chaos, Mussolini acted. On the 23rd of March, 1919, in a hall in Milan, he founded the Fasci Italiani. The movement blended nationalism, anti-communism, and promises of renewal. Its symbol, the fasces, a bundle of rods bound around an axe, evoked ancient Rome and unity through strength. The imagery was deliberate. Mussolini was no longer merely a politician. He was crafting a myth. The first electoral test was humiliating. In the 1919 general election, his movement won no seats. It seemed a failure, but Mussolini learned quickly. Instead of appealing only to ideology, he embraced force. Armed squads known as blackshirts attacked socialist offices, broke strikes, and intimidated opponents. Violence became spectacle. Local authorities often looked away, seeing the fascists as a barrier against revolution. By 1921, Mussolini transformed his movement into the National Fascist Party. He softened certain radical demands to reassure conservatives and business leaders. He presented himself not as a destroyer of order, but as its guardian. His speeches grew grander. "We have created our myth," he declared. The myth is a faith. It is passion. He understood that belief could mobilize crowds more effectively than policy. The turning point came in October 1922. As political instability paralyzed the government, thousands of blackshirts marched towards Rome. The so-called March on Rome was less a military threat than a demonstration of resolve. Yet, the symbolism was powerful. Faced with potential civil conflict, King Victor Emmanuel III made a fateful decision. Rather than declare martial law, he invited Mussolini to form a government. On the 30th of October 1922, at just 39 years old, Benito Mussolini became Prime Minister of Italy. He arrived in Rome by train, dressed formally, projecting confidence. Though the Constitution still stood, real power had begun to shift. It was a remarkable ascent, from expelled socialist to head of government in less than a decade. Yet the method of his success carried a hidden cost. He had legitimized violence as politics. He had taught supporters that intimidation achieved results. To maintain authority, he would need to escalate the theater. Power gained through myth demands, constant reinforcement, and Mussolini had only begun to perform. When Benito Mussolini arrived in Rome in October 1922 as prime minister, he did not yet hold absolute power. Italy was still a constitutional monarchy. Parliament still functioned. Newspapers still criticized him. But Mussolini understood something crucial. Power is rarely seized in a single blow. It is consolidated step by careful step until resistance becomes impossible. At first, he governed cautiously. He formed a coalition government, including liberals and conservatives, presenting himself as a stabilizing force. Many in the elite believed they could control him. They saw him as a useful instrument against socialism. Mussolini encouraged this belief. He wore formal suits, spoke respectfully of the monarchy, and reassured industrial leaders that property would be protected. Yet beneath the surface, his black shirts continued their intimidation. Political opponents were harassed, beaten, or silenced. In 1924, socialist leader Giacomo Matteotti publicly accused the fascists of electoral fraud and violence. Days later, Matteotti was kidnapped and murdered by fascist militants. The crime shocked the nation. For a moment, Mussolini's government trembled. Opposition deputies withdrew from parliament in protest, hoping the king would dismiss Mussolini. But the king hesitated. Mussolini seized the opportunity. On the 3rd of January 1925, he delivered a defiant speech, effectively declaring dictatorship. If fascism has been a criminal association, it proclaimed it, then I am the head of this criminal association. It was both confession and challenge. From that moment, Italy ceased to be a liberal democracy. Over the next few years, Mussolini dismantled the remaining checks on his authority. Opposition parties were banned. Independent newspapers were shut down. A secret police force, the OVRA, monitored dissent. Political prisoners were exiled to remote islands. The press began referring to him as Il Duce, the leader. His image appeared everywhere, on posters, in classrooms, in films. Children were taught to salute him before lessons. In 1929, Mussolini achieved one of his most significant political victories, the Lateran Treaty with the Vatican. For decades, relations between the Italian state and the Catholic Church had been strained. By recognizing Vatican City as an independent state and granting financial compensation, Mussolini secured the Church's recognition of his regime. Church bells rang across Italy. Many citizens interpreted the agreement as divine approval. It strengthened his legitimacy and silenced critics who had questioned his morality. Economically, Mussolini launched grand campaigns designed as much for propaganda as for progress. The battle for grain aimed to increase domestic wheat production and reduce reliance on imports. Posters showed him harvesting crops shirtless, embodying rural strength. A promoted corporate state, claiming to harmonize labor and capital under state supervision. In reality, workers lost the right to strike, and independent unions were dissolved. Stability replaced freedom. Architecture became another tool of ambition. Mussolini ordered the construction of monumental buildings in Rome, inspired by ancient imperial grandeur. Wide avenues were cut through medieval districts to reveal classical ruins. The message was clear. Fascism was the rebirth of Roman power. Mussolini began to see himself as heir to Augustus and Caesar. Everything within the state, nothing outside the state, he declared, summing up his philosophy. By the early 1930s, he was admired abroad by some who saw him as a bulwark against communism. Leaders visited Rome and marveled at the apparent order. Trains, it was said, ran on time. Youth organizations drilled in uniform. Parades displayed disciplined ranks beneath banners of black and gold. Italy appeared unified, but unity achieved through fear has cracks beneath its surface. While the regime projected strength, many Italians complied out of caution rather than conviction. Intellectuals fled the country. Families whispered their doubts behind closed doors. The facade required constant reinforcement. In 1935, Mussolini sought to prove that Italy was once again an empire. He ordered the invasion of Ethiopia, one of the few remaining independent nations in Africa. The campaign was brutal, involving chemical weapons and overwhelming force. Yet at home, it was celebrated as triumph. Crowds cheered as newsreels showed Italian troops marching victoriously. Mussolini proclaimed the birth of a new Roman Empire. Internationally, the invasion led to sanctions from the League of Nations. Rather than weakening him, the sanctions strengthened nationalist sentiment. Italians were told the world envied their resurgence. Mussolini framed criticism as proof of Italy's rising power. By 1935, his transformation was complete. He was no longer simply a political leader. He was the embodiment of the state. Statues bore his likeness. Songs praised his name. The myth he had crafted in 1919 had grown into a national narrative. Yet the very success of that myth carried a silent danger. Mussolini's identity became inseparable from the illusion of strength. To admit error would shatter the image. To show hesitation would undermine the legend. Each victory demanded a greater one to follow. Empire, once invoked, cannot remain symbolic. It demands expansion, confrontation, and proof. And the more Mussolini believed himself to be Rome reborn, the less space remained for caution. The stage was set for rivalry, not only with foreign powers, but with a man across the Alps, who also dreamed of empire. By the mid-1930s, Benito Mussolini stood at what seemed the height of his authority. Italy obeyed him. The church had reconciled with him. Foreign visitors praised him. He believed himself the architect of a new political age, yet beyond Italy's northern border. Another leader was rising, one who had studied Mussolini carefully and drawn inspiration from his methods. In June 1934, Adolf Hitler traveled to Venice to meet Mussolini for the first time. The setting was grand, almost theatrical. Mussolini wore a military uniform adorned with medals, determined to project superiority. Hitler arrived eager but tense, hoping for approval from the man he considered a pioneer of fascism. Their meeting was awkward from the beginning. Mussolini spoke confidently, dominating the conversation. Hitler, at that stage still consolidating power in Germany, appeared less assured. According to later accounts, Mussolini privately dismissed him as a mad little clown. He saw himself as the senior statesman, the mentor in a movement that Germany was only beginning to emulate. The immediate source of tension was Austria. Hitler sought influence there, dreaming of uniting all German-speaking peoples. Mussolini, however, viewed Austria as a buffer state, protecting Italy's northern frontier. When Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss was assassinated by Nazi sympathizers in July 1934, Mussolini reacted sharply. He moved Italian troops to the Brenner Pass, signaling that he would not tolerate German expansion. For a brief moment, Mussolini stood firm against Hitler. Europe watched closely. It seemed possible that the two dictators might become rivals rather than allies. Mussolini even appeared at the Stresa front in 1935, cooperating with Britain and France to oppose German treaty violations. Yet beneath this display of resistance lay vulnerability. The invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 isolated Italy diplomatically. Sanctions from the League of Nations strained the economy. Britain and France, once potential partners, criticized him openly. Mussolini began to feel betrayed by Western democracies he had hoped would recognize his imperial ambitions. Hitler, by contrast, offered admiration and support. Germany refused to condemn Italy's actions in Ethiopia. Gradually, the dynamic shifted. The man Mussolini had once mocked now became useful. Ideological similarities deepened cooperation. Both regimes rejected liberal democracy. Both glorified strength and national destiny. By 1936, the two powers formalized their alignment. Mussolini announced the creation of the Rome-Berlin axis, declaring that the line between the two capitals would become the pivot around which Europe revolved. Publicly, he presented the partnership as a union of equals. Privately, however, the balance was beginning to tilt. Hitler's Germany was industrially stronger and rearming rapidly. Mussolini's Italy, despite its grand imagery, lacked comparable resources. The rivalry had not disappeared. It had transformed. Mussolini still saw himself as the elder visionary. Hitler, however, moved with calculated patience. The first clash between them was not fought on battlefields but in pride. Mussolini wanted admiration. Hitler wanted dominance. What began as mentorship would slowly become dependence. And in that subtle shift, the seeds of Italy's future humiliation were quietly planted. After the declaration of the Rome-Berlin Axis in 1936, the relationship between Mussolini and Hitler deepened, but not in the way Mussolini had imagined. He had hoped to shape Europe as a leading statesman, guiding a new political order. Instead, events began to move at a pace set increasingly by Berlin rather than Rome. The Spanish Civil War became the first testing ground of their partnership. When conflict erupted in Spain in 1936, both leaders supported General Francisco Franco against the Republican government. Mussolini sent tens of thousands of Italian troops and aircraft. He believed the war would demonstrate Italy's military strength and expand fascist influence in the Mediterranean. Yet the campaign proved costly and exposed weaknesses in Italian equipment and organization. Hetman forces, though smaller in number, often appeared more efficient and disciplined. Observers began to notice the difference. Meanwhile, Hitler accelerated Germany's expansion. In 1938, he annexed Austria and the Anschluss, the very move Mussolini had once threatened to prevent. This time, Italy did nothing. Mussolini even congratulated Hitler. The shift was unmistakable. The man who had deployed troops to defend Austrian independence in 1934 now accepted its absorption into the German Reich. Pride yielded to pragmatism, or perhaps to fear of isolation. The same year marked another turning point within Italy itself, seeking closer alignment with Nazi ideology. Mussolini introduced racial laws in 1938 that targeted Jewish Italians. For decades, Jewish citizens had been integrated into Italian society, some even supportive of fascism. The sudden exclusion, banning them from public office, schools, and professions, shocked many Italians. These measures were not rooted in Italy's traditions but mirrored German policies. Privately, some fascist officials expressed discomfort. The laws fractured communities and undermined the claim that fascism represented national unity. Yet Mussolini pressed forward. He had tied his regime's destiny to Hitler's Germany. To retreat would signal weakness. Economic strain also deepened. Military spending increased while resources remained limited. Italy's industrial capacity lagged behind that of Germany, Britain, and France. Yet propaganda masked these weaknesses. Newspapers printed triumphant headlines. Radio broadcasts praised military exercises. Mussolini declared, "The Italian people must be hardened for war." Beneath the confident speeches, doubt lingered. Senior military commanders warned that Italy was unprepared for a major European conflict. Supplies were insufficient. Equipment was outdated. The Navy and Air Force lacked coordination. Still, Mussolini's image as a decisive leader made caution difficult. His authority rested on action, not restraint. In 1939, the Pact of Steel formally bound Italy and Germany in a military alliance. It committed both nations to support one another in war. Mussolini signed the agreement, knowing Italy would need years to prepare. Yet he feared appearing secondary to Hitler if he refused. The rivalry that had once defined their early encounters had evolved into competition for prestige, and Mussolini would not accept the role of spectator. Internally, the cost of this alignment became visible. The regime's promise of national revival began to strain under military commitments and economic pressure. Some Italians grew uneasy, yet dissent was dangerous, and loyalty remained public. By the eve of the Second World War, Mussolini faced a paradox of his own making. He had achieved international relevance through alliance with Germany, but in doing so, he had surrendered independence. The more he sought equality with Hitler, the more Italy's fate became entwined with decisions made in Berlin. The tension was no longer simply diplomatic. It had become personal. Mussolini's identity as the founder of fascism, the original strongman, was slowly overshadowed, and pride, once the engine of his rise, now compelled him toward a conflict he was not prepared to fight. By the late 1930s, Benito Mussolini no longer struggled for recognition within Italy. His authority was embedded in daily life. School children recited pledges of loyalty to Duce. Youth organizations marched in uniform. Workers belonged to state-controlled unions. The press printed only what reinforced the myth. On the surface, acceptance seemed complete. But Mussolini's greatest hunger was no longer domestic. He wanted international validation, not merely as a dictator, but as a statesman equal to the leaders of the great powers. He dreamed of Italy standing beside Germany, Britain, and France as a decisive force in shaping Europe's destiny. The Roman Empire he invoked was not only historical symbolism, it was a standard against which he measured himself. Public ceremonies reinforced this ambition. Mussolini stood on balconies overlooking vast crowds, chin lifted, arms folded, allowing silence to build before speaking. The architecture of fascist Rome expanded around him, clean lines, massive columns, an imperial scale. Each building was designed to communicate permanence. Italy was not temporary. Fascism was not transitional. It was, in his mind, inevitable. Yet the image masked a fragile reality. Italy's economy remained weaker than its propaganda suggested. Autarky, the policy of economic self-sufficiency, limited trade and strained resources. Industrial output lagged behind Germany's accelerating war machine. While Hitler rearmed with ruthless efficiency, Italy struggled to modernize. Still, Mussolini's pride pushed him forward. He could not allow Hitler to dominate Europe without Italian participation. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, triggering war with Britain and France, Mussolini hesitated. He declared Italy non-belligerent, a term crafted to preserve honor while avoiding immediate involvement. Privately, he admitted that Italy was unprepared for a large-scale war. This hesitation revealed a tension between image and capability. To his people, Mussolini portrayed confidence. He assured them Italy would choose the right moment. Yet the longer he delayed, the more he risked appearing secondary to Hitler. The rivalry for status intensified, even within alliance. Meanwhile, ordinary Italians experienced growing anxiety. Military drills increased. Resources were diverted towards defense. Food prices rose. Families with sons of military age sensed what was coming. Yet opposition remained muted. Years of censorship and surveillance had eroded organized resistance. Many citizens had adapted to the regime, finding stability preferable to uncertainty. The introduction of racial laws in 1938 further complicated public perception. Jewish Italians, who had long been integrated into society, suddenly found themselves excluded from professions and education. Some Italians were uncomfortable, but few protested openly. Acceptance of authority had become habit. The regime's narrative, that sacrifice was necessary for national strength, dampened moral hesitation. Within Mussolini himself, however, the battle for status grew sharper. He followed Hitler's campaigns closely. The swift German victories in Poland and Scandinavia impressed the world. Newspapers across Europe acknowledged German military superiority. Mussolini feared Italy would be left on the margins of a reshaped continent. He once declared that Italy needed a few thousand dead to sit at the peace table as an equal. In June 1940, as France collapsed under German assault, Mussolini made his choice. Despite warnings from generals about unprepared forces, he declared war on Britain and France. Standing before a cheering crowd in Rome on the 10th of June 1940, he announced that Italy would enter the conflict. The balcony roared with applause. Publicly, it appeared as a confident step into history. Privately, it was a gamble driven by pride. Mussolini believed the war would be brief, and that Italy would claim territorial rewards. He imagined himself present at negotiations, shaping the post-war order alongside Hitler. Yet from the beginning, Italy's military struggles became evident. Campaigns in the Alps yielded limited gains, equipment shortages plagued operations. Coordination faltered, the myth of invincibility began to crack. The cost of social acceptance now emerged. Years of orchestrated loyalty had created a nation conditioned to obey, but not necessarily prepared for hardship. Citizens who had celebrated speeches now faced rationing and uncertainty. Soldiers marched with enthusiasm shaped by propaganda, not experience. For Mussolini, the deeper loss was internal. By tying his legitimacy to constant expansion, he had removed the possibility of retreat. To admit unpreparedness would destroy the persona of Il Duce. To question alliance with Germany would expose dependency. The battle for status had reshaped his identity. Once the pioneer of fascism, he now chased validation from a partner whose power exceeded his own. The rivalry that began in Venice had evolved into silent comparison. Military strength against theatrical confidence. Social acceptance within Italy remained largely intact in appearance, but beneath it lay strain. Families whispered concerns. Officers questioned strategy in private. Economic shortages hinted at deeper vulnerability. Between 1936 and 1940, Mussolini achieved what he most desired: international relevance. Italy stood among the powers at war. The Axis alliance defined European politics. He had secured a seat at the table of destiny, but the price was subtle and enduring. Independence had diminished. Moral compromise had deepened. Pride had overridden caution. In pursuing recognition as Rome reborn, Mussolini had bound Italy's future to a war. It was ill-equipped to fight, and once that commitment was made, there was no simple path back to stability. The rivalry had ceased to be about admiration or comparison. It had become survival. When Italy entered the Second World War in June 1940, Mussolini imagined a swift and glorious campaign. France appeared near collapse. Britain seemed isolated. Germany advanced with unstoppable force. It seemed, to him, the perfect moment to claim spoils without bearing the full weight of battle. Reality unfolded differently. Italy's armed forces were not prepared for a sustained war. Weapons were outdated. Supplies were inconsistent. Communication between branches of the military lacked coordination. Generals privately admitted their concerns, but few dared confront the Duce directly. His authority, built on certainty, discouraged contradiction. The first campaigns exposed weakness. In North Africa, Italian troops struggled against British forces. In October 1940, Mussolini ordered an invasion of Greece from Albania, hoping for a quick victory that would prove Italian strength, independent of German assistance. Instead, the Greek army pushed Italian forces back. What was meant to be a demonstration of power became an embarrassment. Hitler was forced to intervene in the Balkans in 1941, diverting German resources to stabilize a front created by Mussolini's ambition. The imbalance between the two leaders grew visible. Germany rescued Italy repeatedly, in Greece, in North Africa, and later in Sicily. Each intervention chipped away at Mussolini's claim to equality. At home, the consequences deepened. British bombers struck Italian cities. Industrial centers suffered damage. Civilian casualties rose. Food shortages became more severe. Rationing tightened. The same citizens who had once cheered from balconies now queued for bread. Under air raid sirens, propaganda continued, but its tone shifted. Instead of triumphant certainty, it emphasized endurance. Mussolini insisted that hardship would strengthen the nation. War is to man what maternity is to woman. He had once declared a statement meant to glorify sacrifice. Yet for families losing sons on distant fronts, such words rang hollow. Within the fascist hierarchy, doubt began to surface. Some officials questioned strategy. Others feared Germany's growing dominance. Yet dissent remained cautious. The regime's culture of loyalty suppressed open opposition. By 1942, the war had turned decisively against the Axis. German defeats Stalingrad signaled vulnerability. In North Africa, Allied forces advanced. Italy's coastline lay exposed. The Mediterranean, once imagined as iteris mare nostrum, our sea, became a battleground increasingly controlled by the Allies. Mussolini's public appearances grew less confident. His once commanding posture appeared heavier, his gestures slower. Those close to him noted fatigue. The myth of unstoppable leadership strained under military failure. The stage was now set for a reckoning. Italy faced invasion. The monarchy watched anxiously. Military commanders questioned whether the Duce's continued rule endangered the nation. For 2 decades, Mussolini had shaped Italy in his image. Theatrical, proud, defiant. Now that image confronted collapse. The war he entered to secure prestige threatened to erase everything he had built. The balance between myth and reality could no longer be maintained, and his Allied forces prepared to land on Italian soil. The question was no longer whether Mussolini would prevail, but whether he would survive the consequences of his own ambition. By the summer of 1943, the illusion of control had begun to crumble. Allied forces had landed in Sicily in July, advancing steadily across Italian territory. Bombs fell on Rome for the first time. The war, once distant and framed as heroic expansion, had come home. Inside the fascist leadership, anxiety hardened into urgency. For months, senior figures had watched Italy weaken under the strain of conflict. Military defeats, economic exhaustion, and civilian unrest signaled that the regime could not continue unchanged. Yet confronting Mussolini directly required courage few possessed. He had ruled for over 20 years. His authority had shaped careers, loyalty, and fear. On the 24th of July 1943, the Fascist Grand Council convened for the first time in years. The meeting was tense from the outset. Dino Grandi, a former ally of Mussolini, presented a motion calling for the restoration of constitutional powers to King Victor Emmanuel III. It was framed as a patriotic necessity, a way to preserve Italy from total collapse, but its meaning was unmistakable. Mussolini's power must end. The debate lasted through the night. Mussolini defended his leadership, arguing that unity was essential in wartime. Yet the tone had shifted. The same men who once praised him now spoke cautiously, but firmly, of responsibility and survival. Years of unquestioned dominance had given way to doubt. In the early hours of the 25th of July, the council voted. The motion passed, 19 in favor, 7 against. Though technically advisory, the vote signaled the collapse of Mussolini's internal support. The myth of unanimous loyalty shattered in a single count. Still, Mussolini did not fully grasp the finality of the moment. The following afternoon, he met King Victor Emmanuel III at the Villa Savoia. He expected discussion, perhaps even reassurance. Instead, the king informed him calmly that he was dismissed as prime minister. Marshal Pietro Badalò would replace him. The king reportedly told him, "Italy is broken to pieces." It was both judgment and farewell. As Mussolini left the palace, he was arrested by royal guards. There was no dramatic struggle, no final speech from a balcony. The man who had commanded crowds was escorted quietly into an ambulance under guard. News of his dismissal spread rapidly across Italy. That evening, radio broadcasts announced his removal. In many cities, citizens poured into the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. Fascist symbols were torn down. Portraits of El Duces were removed from walls. The speed of public reaction revealed a truth Mussolini had long ignored. Obedience does not always equal devotion. The confrontation was not fought with gunfire or spectacle. It unfolded in council chambers and royal offices, through signatures and votes. Yet its emotional force was immense. For Mussolini, it marked the collapse of the identity he had built for over 2 decades. The point of no return had arrived. He had believed himself inseparable from the state. Now, the state had severed him. Even if events were to change again, the aura of invincibility was gone. His authority had been revoked, not by foreign enemies, but by his own allies and monarch. The empire he imagined had not fallen in battle. It had dissolved in a meeting room. And though his story was not yet over, it would never again be his alone to command. Mussolini's arrest on the 25th of July, 1943, did not end his story. It ended his authority. After his dismissal, he was moved between secret locations under heavy guard, first on the island of Ponza, then to La Maddalena, and finally to a remote mountain hotel at Gran Sasso. The monarchy and the new Italian government hoped to prevent Germany from using him as a symbol. But Hitler had no intention of abandoning the man who had once inspired him. On the 12th of September 1943, German commandos carried out a daring rescue mission known as Operation Oak. They landed gliders near the mountain hotel and freed Mussolini without firing a shot. He was flown to Germany, where Hitler greeted him not as an equal, but as a diminished ally. Mussolini appeared physically weakened. Observers described him as pale, heavier, and visibly tired. The confident orator of the 1920s seemed distant. Hitler persuaded him to lead a new regime in northern Italy, the Italian Social Republic, based in the town of Salo. In truth, it was a puppet state, controlled largely by Germany. The man who once ruled Italy from Rome now governed a fragment of it under foreign supervision. The consequences were brutal. Italy descended into civil war. Loyal fascists, Herman troops, and anti-fascist partisans fought across towns and countryside. Families divided, neighbors informed on one another. The conflict was no longer only international, it was personal and internal. Mussolini attempted to revive ideological purity and he spoke of returning to revolutionary roots and punishing traitors. Several former fascist officials who had voted against him in July were tried and executed, including his own son-in-law, Galasso Ciano. The trials were swift. The sentences were final. It was both revenge and desperation. Yet the Italian Social Republic lacked legitimacy. Its economy was shattered. Its military weak. German officers made strategic decisions. Mussolini's speeches, once amplified by the grandeur of Rome, now echoed in smaller halls. His power had narrowed to rhetoric. Meanwhile, the wider war turned decisively against the Axis. Allied forces advanced northward through Italy in 1944 and early 1945. Cities lay in ruins. Civilians endured hunger and bombardment. The cost of Mussolini's alliance with Hitler became visible in destroyed homes and grieving families. By April 1945, the collapse was unavoidable. German defenses crumbled. Partisan forces gained control of key regions. Mussolini attempted to flee north towards Switzerland, hoping perhaps to negotiate asylum or reach German-held territory. On the 27th of April 1945, near Lake Como, Italian partisans captured him. He was disguised in a German uniform, hiding among retreating troops. Recognition came quickly. The once omnipresent image of Il Duce was impossible to conceal. The following day, the 28th of April 1945, Mussolini and his companion, Clara Petacci, were executed by firing squad. The decision was swift, driven by fear that Allied forces might intervene or that fascist loyalists might attempt rescue. But the execution itself was not the final act. Their bodies were transported to Milan and displayed publicly in Piazzale Loreto. They were hung upside down from a metal girder at a petrol station. Crowds gathered. Some spat. Others shouted insults. It was a raw eruption of anger built over years of repression and war. For 2 decades, Mussolini had crafted spectacle as a tool of control. Now, spectacle turned against him. The image of his body suspended before a furious crowd traveled across the world. It symbolized not only his death, but the violent collapse of fascism in Italy. The aftermath reshaped the nation. In 1946, a national referendum abolished the monarchy and established the Italian Republic. The political order Mussolini had promised to strengthen had instead disintegrated. The king who dismissed him was forced into exile. The state he claimed to embody was reborn without him. The long-term impact lingered. Italy faced years of reconstruction and political instability. The moral reckoning was complex. Some Italians claimed they had never supported fascism. Others remembered the early years of stability with conflicted nostalgia. The nation struggled to reconcile memory with responsibility. For Mussolini personally, the ultimate consequence was humiliation. He had sought immortality through empire. Instead, his final image became one of defeat and exposure. The myth dissolved in public anger. The point of no return had come not only in his dismissal, but in his decision to return under German protection. By accepting the role of puppet ruler, he surrendered any remaining claim to independent authority. Reconciliation with Italy became impossible. He had mistaken himself for Rome's empire, believing that his will and the nation's destiny were one. Yet Rome endured beyond him. Italy endured beyond him. What did not endure was the illusion that one man could command history without consequence. In the final months of his life, Benito Mussolini no longer resembled the man who once stood boldly on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia. The posture remained familiar. Chin raised, shoulders squared. But the energy had drained away. Those who saw him in Salo described a leader burdened not only by military defeat, but by private realization. The Italian Social Republic was fragile from its beginning. German officers held decisive power. Supplies were scarce. Communication lines were fractured by partisan activity. Mussolini issued proclamations, yet their impact felt diminished. He had once commanded a nation. Now he struggled to command belief. There were moments of attempted defiance. He ordered harsh reprisals against resistance fighters. He approved the trial and execution of former fascist officials who had voted against him in July 1943. Among them was Galeazzo, his son-in-law. The decision revealed the narrowing of his world. Loyalty had become suspicion. Family bonds yielded to political survival. Yet alongside these acts of severity, signs of doubt emerged. In private conversations and letters, particularly to Clara Petacci, he expressed fatigue. "I have made mistakes," he reportedly admitted in one exchange. Whether these words signaled true remorse or simple exhaustion is debated. What is clear is that certainty had eroded. The war around him accelerated beyond his control. Allied forces advanced steadily north. German commanders prioritized their own strategic retreats. Mussolini, once obsessed with expansion, now contemplated escape. The language of empire faded into the language of endurance. Internally, he faced a battle He had long postponed the confrontation between image and reality. For years, he had insisted that fascism was destiny, that his leadership embodied national will. Now that narrative fractured, Italy's suffering could not be hidden behind architecture or slogans. Bombed cities and grieving families contradicted the myth of renewal. His authority had depended on projection of strength. Admitting vulnerability threatened the entire foundation of his rule. Yet vulnerability surrounded him. His speeches grew shorter. Public appearances became rare. Observers noted that he often seemed distant, staring for long moments before speaking. In April 1945, as German defenses collapsed and partisan forces gained ground, Mussolini's final decision approached. To remain meant capture. To flee meant acknowledging defeat. He chose flight, attempting to reach the Swiss border under disguise. That choice was not merely tactical. It symbolized the end of the persona he had crafted. The man who once declared, "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state," now sought refuge outside the state entirely. His final battles were no longer about empire or ideology. They were about survival and legacy. But by then, legacy was slipping beyond his control. The reckoning he had delayed for decades arrived not through debate, but through inevitability. Power, once absolute, had narrowed to a single question. How would history remember him? When Mussolini fell in April 1945, his body was broken, but his imprint on Italy did not vanish overnight. Dictatorships rarely disappear cleanly. They leave behind stone, language, habits, and silence. Across Rome and other Italian cities, the architecture of fascism still stood. Wide avenues carved through ancient neighborhoods. Government buildings designed with rigid symmetry and imposing scale. The Ur district in Rome, planned for a world exposition that never took place, remained a monument to fascist ambition. Clean lines, white marble, arches echoing imperial Rome. These structures were meant to project permanence. They did not crumble with their creator. For decades after the war, Italians debated what to do with these symbols. Some argued they should be destroyed, erased from public life. Others insisted they were part of national history, uncomfortable but real. In the end, most remained. Buildings were repurposed, streets were renamed. The stone endured, but its meaning shifted. Mussolini himself had carefully intertwined his image with ancient Rome. He presented fascism as the rebirth of imperial strength. Statues, slogans, and school textbooks reinforced this connection. After his death, the new Italian Republic faced a dilemma: how to separate the nation's ancient heritage from the dictator who claimed to embody it. The monarchy, which had once enabled his rise, was abolished in 1946. In a national referendum, Italians chose a republic. The royal family went into exile. In that decision lay a broader reckoning. It was not only Mussolini's regime that had failed, the institutions that allowed it to flourish were also judged. Public memory fractured into layers. For many Italians, Mussolini became a warning, a symbol of how Italy pride and spectacle can overwhelm democracy. Schools taught the dangers of authoritarianism. Memorials honored resistance fighters who opposed fascism. The narrative emphasized liberation and renewal. Yet memory is rarely uniform. In some towns, older generations remembered the early years of order in public works. They spoke of trains running on time, of reduced street violence, of national pride restored after the humiliation of the First World War. Nostalgia coexisted with condemnation. Political movements occasionally invoked his name, not to restore dictatorship, but to evoke discipline or strength. This tension revealed a deeper truth. Mussolini's legacy was not a simple line from glory to disgrace. It was a contested space, shaped by perspective. Internationally, his name became shorthand for failed ambition. Historians studied his rise as a case of how economic instability and political fear can open the door to extremism. His alliance with Hitler placed him firmly within the broader tragedy of the Second World War. He was remembered not as a visionary, but as a cautionary figure who overreached, even within his own family. Legacy carried complexity. Some relatives distanced themselves from his memory. Others sought to reinterpret it. The private cost of public infamy lingered long after his death. There were also intangible remnants: the culture of strong leadership, the habit of rallying around a central figure, the lingering suspicion between ideological camps, These patterns did not disappear instantly. In 1945, nations, like individuals, carry echoes of their past. Perhaps the most enduring symbol of his fall was not architectural at all, but photographic. The image of his body displayed in Milan became one of the defining photographs of the 20th century. It represented reversal. The spectacle maker reduced to spectacle. Yet even that image cannot capture the full complexity of his memory. To some, it symbolized justice. To others, humiliation. To historians, it marked the collapse of a myth carefully constructed over 2 decades. The buildings remain, the archives remain. The debates remain. Mussolini sought to inscribe his name beside the emperors of Rome. Instead, his legacy became a chapter in the study of power, how it is gained, how it is abused, and how it collapses under its own weight. Italy moved forward as a republic, integrating into European alliances and rebuilding its economy. The country that once marched beneath fascist banners became a democracy within a broader European community. In that transformation lies a final irony. The nation endured and adapted, while the man who claimed to embody it could not. Stone lasts longer than speeches. Institutions outlive personalities. And the empire Mussolini imagined exists today only in memory, debated, studied, and questioned. The formal decline of Mussolini's power ended in April 1945, but the decline of his influence unfolded more gradually. Dictators may fall in a day, their shadows linger longer. In the immediate aftermath of his execution, Italy entered a period of reckoning. The civil war between fascists and partisans left wounds that would not heal quickly. Neighbors who had informed on one another now had to share streets again. Families, divided by ideology, faced uneasy reconciliation. The nation, exhausted by war and occupation, focused first on survival. The abolition of the monarchy in 1946 marked a symbolic break from the system that had enabled Mussolini's rise. By voting for a republic, Italians signaled a desire for new foundations. A democratic constitution followed in 1948, designed carefully to prevent concentration of power in one individual. Checks and balances were struck. The trauma of dictatorship shaped the architecture of the new state. Economically, Italy struggled through shortages and reconstruction before entering a period of rapid growth in the 1950s and 1960s. The Italian economic miracle transformed the country into an industrial power. Factories expanded, infrastructure modernized. A younger generation grew up in a republic rather than a dictatorship. For many of them, fascism became history rather than lived experience. Yet the memory did not fade entirely. Political groups occasionally revisited elements of nationalist rhetoric. Debates about Mussolini resurfaced during moments of economic or social tension. Some argued that his early years brought stability. Others insisted that such arguments ignored the cost of repression and war. The final outcome of Mussolini's story rests in this duality. He succeeded in centralizing power and reshaping Italy's political culture for over 2 decades. He failed in preserving independence, achieving sustainable empire, or protecting his nation from devastation. Most importantly, he misjudged the endurance of personal authority. He believed that by fusing his identity with the state, he could outlast opposition. Instead, when the state withdrew its support, he stood exposed. The man who once proclaimed everything within the state, nothing outside the state, ultimately found himself outside both. Outside government, outside protection, outside history's mercy. Italy survived. The Republic adapted. Europe moved forward. The empire Mussolini imagined dissolved completely. The visible costs of Mussolini's rule are recorded in numbers casualties of war, cities damaged, political prisoners exiled. But there is another cost, less easily measured. For over 20 years, Italians were encouraged to surrender individual judgment in favor of collective identity. Loyalty to the leader replaced loyalty to principle. Children grew up saluting a portrait before learning to question authority. That habit of obedience left a subtle imprint on civic life. The regime also distorted truth. Propaganda blurred the line between fact and performance. Newspapers reported victories that concealed setbacks. Speeches magnified achievements while minimizing failures. When reality eventually contradicted rhetoric, the disorientation was profound. Citizens struggled to reconcile what they had been told with what they experienced. There was also the psychological cost. to Mussolini himself. To sustain the myth of infallibility required constant performance. Doubt could not be shown. Vulnerability had to be hidden. Over time, the persona of Il Duce consumed the private individual. Decisions were shaped not only by strategy, but by the need to maintain image. Pride narrowed options. The introduction of racial laws fractured communities that had coexisted for generations. Jewish Italians, who had lived as full citizens, were suddenly defined as outsiders. Even after the war, rebuilding trust proved difficult. The rupture left scars that extended beyond policy into personal relationships. And perhaps the most lasting cost was the lesson learned too late, that national pride without restraint can transform into national tragedy. Mussolini promised dignity and revival. For a time, many believed him. The later collapse did not erase that early faith. It complicated it. History often records what was built and what was destroyed. It less often records the habits shaped in between the silent adjustments, the gradual acceptance of authoritarian language, the comfort of certainty over complexity. Those habits, once formed, take generations to unwind. Benito Mussolini rose from rural poverty to the center of European power by understanding one simple truth. People in uncertainty crave certainty. He offered clarity where there was confusion, strength where there was fear, pride where there was humiliation. Through spectacle, discipline, and myth, he convinced a nation that he embodied its destiny. And for a time, it worked. He restored order to a fractured political system. He reconciled church and state. He made Italy visible on the world stage. But every gain was tied to a deeper compromise. Power built on fear required silence. Prestige built on war required sacrifice. Identity built on myth required constant escalation. What he won was authority, concentrated, theatrical, and absolute. What he lost was restraint. And without restraint, ambition turned reckless. In seeking to revive Rome's empire, he mistook symbolism for strength. He confused admiration with equality. He believed that history could be commanded by will alone. Yet history is less forgiving than applause. The final image of his life, displayed in a public square, stripped of dignity, stands in stark contrast to the balconies and banners of his rise. It reminds us that power without humility rarely endures. Italy survived. The Republic rebuilt. The buildings remain, repurposed and reinterpreted. What endured was the nation. What did not endure was the illusion that one man could become its empire. Mussolini gained control over Italy for more than 2 decades. But in the process, he lost independence, moral authority, and ultimately his own place in the story he tried to dominate. History's greatest victories often leave invisible scars, and sometimes the loudest rise carries within it the quiet certainty of a fall.